Good evening and thank you for joining me. Sorry it's taken this long. I've had some problems with my webcam. I wanted to thank all of my subscribers for getting me up to 10 subscribers, and I look forward to everybody joining me with the conversation. Tonight we will be going over Federalist Paper number 5, which is relating to what would occur if several different states did not join together in one cohesive government, but continue to remain separate, and considering the consistent isolation and mutual competitiveness that would occur as opposed to mutual cooperation. Don't forget, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out whenever I upload a new video. There's a link to the Tom Woods Liberty Classroom where you can really expand your knowledge of free market economics, which is the same school of thought that Milton Friedman as well as Murray Rothbard really championed. Well, as I said, this is going to be about Federalist Paper number 5, again from John Jay, to the Independent Journal, to the people of New York. John Jay remarks, first of all, relating to a letter from Queen Anne to the Parliament of Scotland, as the governments of England and Scotland were beginning to merge. There are two excerpts from this, and I'll go ahead and quote them right now. An entire perfect union will be the solid foundation of lasting peace. It will secure your religion, liberty, and property, remove the animosities amongst yourselves, and the jealousies and differences betwixt our two kingdoms. It must increase your strength, riches, and trade, and by this union the whole island, being joined in affection and free from all apprehensions of different interest, will be enabled to resist all its enemies. The second excerpt is, we most earnestly recommend to you all calmness and unanimity in this great and weighty affair, that the union may be brought to a happy conclusion, being the only effectual way to secure our present and future happiness, and disappoint the designs of our and your enemies, who will doubtless in this occasion use their utmost endeavors to prevent or delay this union. Jay was referring back to a previous paper, acknowledging the weaknesses and divisions now within the United States would invite hostilities from foreign nations. He also reinforced only union and the strength and the self-government from that union would most ensure our protections from hostilities from abroad. Now, in discussing this, Jay references his shared understanding of the history of Great Britain, or the UK. He reinforces that it was general knowledge at this point that he's discussing that it was better that they were united due to that shared protection. Despite that, for ages past, they were basically a collection of warring nations that were always fighting amongst each other in mutual jealousy for effectively the exact same target. In this case, we were referring to the governments of Britain, Ireland, and Scotland. He reinforced that although they held the same desires, meaning trade, potentially expansion through invasion of the various countries over in the continent that they normally refer to as Europe, that despite that they continually warred amongst themselves. Jay reinforced that it was through continual incitement of hostilities by these European nations that kept those three nations warring amongst each other, because obviously those nations realized that if Scotland, Ireland, and Britain unified together, that collective political power, their collective resources, their collective armament, warfighting capability would make them an even greater power to contend with then just the three of them separated apart. So it was to the general advantage of all of the overall European nations to simply keep them from uniting. Jay was reminding his readers that correlating that history to what the current citizens of the various states post-revolution would consider was that should America fall into the same trap of dividing into smaller nations or confederacies, they could quite probably be prone to fall into the same exact problems that those three original nations fell into, meaning warring mutually amongst each other, being held up by mutual jealousies. I'm quoting Jay in this: envy and jealousy would soon extinguish confidence and affection and all the partial interests of each confederacy, instead of the general interests of all America, would be the only objects of their policy and pursuits. Now, referencing back that previously known history, that bordering nations, not necessarily friendly, but simply bordering nations, would be highly probably more prone to mutual jealousy instead of general cooperation. Would be prone to mutual jealousy and conflict, or simply to live in fear of those jealousies and conflicts. But first, if you wish to learn more about this subject, please ensure to look below at the description box for the book of the Federalist Papers, which is provided by the Institute for Principal Studies, which is an amazing organization which provides further information on similar topics of this type. Jay made sure to point out that even the greatest advocates of the idea of multiple separate confederacies of the states, meaning America, remaining within that current situation, or just coalescing into those smaller confederacies, that they could not reasonably expect for all of those confederacies or states to remain in mutually equal levels of strength, at least not for very long over the amount of years. And really, how could they remain so given human intervention? Jay goes further into pointing out that independent of local circumstances, which would tend to promote, say, if we were in separate confederacies now, meaning separate, just smaller governments, that we would tend to promote our welfare over that of another state or another collection of states or confederacies, to promote our advantage over them. He reinforced that the best management and policy would be better promoted under one government. Would be better promoted over one government over all of the rest, instead of just a collection of kind of competing governments. And that being under one government would, in effect, eliminate all of these mutually competing jealousies. He reinforced that it would not be reasonable to expect that each of the competing confederacies would be able to provide the same attributes of each other over a long period of time. Now, the quote that he references for this is, "For it cannot be presumed that the same degree of sound policy, prudence, and foresight would be uniformly observed by each of these confederacies for a long succession of years." Now, what does that mean? What that means is that eventually these confederacies would fracture away from mutual cooperation. And that they would not maintain good uniform governance. In other words, each state would not be governing unlike each other. Like, say, the collection of, say, the Northeast, New York, Rhode Island, whatever, if they formed one confederacy, they would not be instantly agreeing to maintain their governance the same way as, say, if Oregon, Washington, California, and Nevada decided to join together in one confederacy. They would eventually decide to seek their own advantage over that of their neighbors. Now, Jay reinforces that in whatever fashion it would take, in whatever fashion it would happen, that any one of these states or confederacies would rise in their level of political influence, their level of warfighting capability, their level of trade and marketing ability, between their own neighbors as well as foreign governments, and that this level of rise in ability would incite fear and jealousy amongst their neighbors, that this level of competition would arouse fear and envy amongst their neighbors, that this fear and envy would inevitably lead to conflict or even war amongst each other, just as like what happened multiple times between Ireland, Britain, and Scotland. That they would be seeking for somehow to diminish the advantages of their neighbor, that they would try to provide obstacles for that state, for that confederacy, so that they would not grow in any more power. They would seek to provide obstacles to the increase in influence in power and ability of that other confederacy, so that they do not grow even further beyond their bordering confederacies. Now, an example for us to be considering would be, say, the continually expanding government's influence and power and market economy of, say, New York or even California. If these states just continue to grow in their influence, and they were separate not under uniform governments of the United States, but they were separate nations unto themselves, then their bordering nations would begin to grow continuously, increasingly jealous of those ever-growing options, of those ever-growing influences by those separate nations. He made the acknowledgement that it wouldn't take long for even those growing nations to begin to feel the resentment of their bordering neighbors and to feel the same way towards them, sort of like a reciprocation of resentment, given the either implied or expressed obstacles being or attempted to being imposed upon those growing nations, those growing states. Now the quote is, the North is generally the region of strength, and many local circumstances render it probable that the most northern of the proposed confederacies would, at a period not very distant, be unquestionably more formidable than any of the others. No sooner would this become evident than the northern hive would excite the same ideas and sensations in the more southern parts of America which it formerly did in the southern parts of Europe. Nor does it appear to be a rash conjecture that its young swarms might often be tempted to gather honey in the more blooming fields and milder air of their luxurious and more delicate neighbors. Now, essentially, Jay is alluding to that the northern confederacies, being more prosperous industrially and economically than their southern neighbors, considering them as separate nations, that they would incite tensions and jealousies within the southern nations, the southern confederacies, and potentially even retaliate for those jealousies, for those obstacles, for those resentments, with an invasion against those confederacies, and potentially just take all those awesome agricultural resources that the southern confederacies were known for the enrichment of the North. Jay makes the interesting consideration that those nations that share borders would be less friends as much as borderers, essentially jealous neighbors, jealous next door neighbors that you might have problems with now. Quote is that they would neither love nor trust one another, but on the contrary, they would be a prey to discord, jealousy, and mutual injuries. He makes sure to reinforce and acknowledge that this situation would place us in a situation that foreign governments would prefer to see us in, that we would only be formidable to ourselves and not to them, that would pose a threat to them, only to each other. Now, given these analyses, Jay is attempting to correct the perceptions of those people who are championing the idea of confederacies allying with one another for mutual defense, and then to acknowledge that they are incorrect in those same champions, considering that these confederacies would form mutual defense, that they would form unions and sharing arms and resources needed to keep the mutual defense against foreign enemies. He does this by acknowledging the histories of Great Britain, Scotland, and Ireland, and how they interacted with their warring neighbors. And how Britain and Ireland interacted as warring neighbors. But for your consideration, Those fans of Ron Paul, go ahead and check out his homeschool curriculum also below in the description box. Jay makes sure to ask the question, when did other separate nations, such as Britain or Spain, ever join together for common cause against a shared enemy? He reinforces that each confederacy, each state, would be its own separate independent nation, with each their own affinities to political power and commerce and allies and enemies. Each treaty that they would enter into with a foreign power would be distinct to the relationship between that state and that foreign power, with no consideration of how that treaty would affect their neighboring states or confederacies, and that these treaties would be distinct to their own relative markets. Jay points out that it is conceivable that, say, the southern confederacies might be at war with a foreign nation that the northern confederacies are friendly with. So it would become a contradictory interest for the northern confederacies and the southern confederacies to ally with each other, given that difference in treaties and in market interest. That is, should they remain independent of one another and not under a unified government. And that if such an alliance would be formed, it wouldn't really be carried out in good faith. Jay makes sure to point out that it is far more probable that America would go the way of Europe at the time, with opposing nations acting under selfish and opposing interests, and quote-unquote unfriendly passions, and that they would be frequently taking sides with those foreign powers that they would be friendly with. Now, he makes sure to note that given our relative distance to foreign powers over in Europe, it is far more likely for us to have conflicts with each other as separate independent nations, while seeking out aid and benefit from those foreign countries. His quote in this is, "And therefore each of them would be more desirous to guard against the others by the aid of foreign alliances than to guard against foreign dangers by alliances between each other, between themselves. And let us not forget how much more easy it is to receive foreign fleets into our ports and foreign armies into our country than it is to persuade or compel them to depart." So it's like a translation. It's easier. It would have been easier for them to receive armies and fleets as aid from another nation. But then again, trying to get rid of them is a whole different story, because once they're there, it would be difficult to expel them. Jay lastly ensures to note regarding the Romans, how many conquests did they undertake under the guise of being friends, and what changes or innovations did they include or inject into the governments that they're supposedly helping out, pretty much to be more friendly towards Rome and not so much towards their bordering neighbors that they intended to quote-unquote protect. As a final quote, "Let candid men judge then whether the division of America into any given number of independent sovereignties would tend to secure us against the hostilities and improper interference of foreign nations." Thank you for joining me, and have a good evening.